Saturday, May 20th marked the second part of the Passport to History event. For those who missed the first part of this multi-part series covering said event, the Passport to History is an event coordinated by GOAL, Greater Outdoor Activities and Learning, in conjunction with the Norte Historical Society. The event is separated into several different parts or zones with different themes of local history. Each zone consists of several locations participants will visit on a guided tour, each location with its own unique stamp for participants' passports. Every month we'll cover a different zone, the second of these zones being Zone B, which focused on locations along the city's north coast including Brother Jonathan Memorial Park and the Tolowa Dunes. As with the previous Passport to History, we met outside the Historical Society. This time a family was there early. After waiting for stragglers, to our dismay there were none, we once again gandered through the museum. After learning about the places we were about to visit, the participants, me and the one family, left the museum to be greeted by a bus. Expecting a greater turnout, GOAL had partnered with Redwood Coast Transit Authority to get a bus to ferry us around. The first stop on our bus route through history was the Roscoe Peterson Park, a baseball diamond dedicated to a local baseball player killed in World War II.
So for the longest time, this was known as Peterson Park. It's where the baseball games are held and all. And it wasn't until just a few years ago that the Daughters of the American Revolution put in the memorial to Rocky Peterson, Roscoe Peterson, known as Rocky Peterson, for whom the park was named. He was a graduate of Del Norte High. He offered and played professional ball. He played up in Portland area, played in the minors, and he was when he enlisted in the Navy and was stationed at Pearl Harbor and was on the Arizona the day the Japanese bombed it. So he went down 1941. I can't remember. I could get 41 and 42 together. So he went down. He's still in the Arizona, and he is remembered here.
Once the more youthful participants had indulged themselves in the opportunity to run the bases, we were once again on the road, this time destined for Brother Jonathan Memorial Park.
The Brother Jonathan was a steamship that routinely traveled from San Francisco up to Seattle. Out where the Point St. George Lighthouse is right now, they were called the Dragon Rocks because they were going to devour any ships that came by. And this was George Vancouver who named them, the captain of the explorer ship, who named them the Dragon Rocks. Because the reef extends basically off and goes about 6 miles out. So in bad weather, there's a narrow channel in between where that reef is and the rocks, and it was very difficult to maneuver. So the Brother Jonathan on that fateful voyage had stopped in Crescent City, picked up its passengers. However, was told by the company that it was to take a load of lumber and gold with it. And the captain was extremely concerned because he felt the ship had been overloaded. But in those days, captains only had the say-so at ocean. They did not have the say-so when they were in harbor and at the docks. The company determined that. So it was against his advice that he was told to take on this extra cargo, very heavy cargo, and as well as the 292 passengers, I think it was. Yeah, so over 200. Some of the passengers on that voyage were very notable. There was a British consulate, a member of the British consulate was on that ship at that time. The newly appointed governor of Washington Territory was on the ship that night also. The ship, the seas were rough as they often are, and waves pushed that heavy load in that ship up against the rocks. The ship was being battered. They attempted to lower lifeboats. And in the first set of lifeboats was women and children. It was very typical in those days. And unfortunately, they could not get away and ended up on the rocks and overturning. I believe there were 2 more lifeboats, one of which also did not make it ashore. There were only 19 survivors, and they were all in that one boat that could make it ashore. And so there's a lot of stories about it. What it did do was to lead to the construction of at the time, the most expensive and most extraordinary lighthouse ever built in U.S. lighthouse history. Congress, it took about 10 years for Congress not 10 years, about 4 years for Congress to fund it, and then 10 years to construct it. And it was fascinating. The engineer, architect engineer who did the Tillamook Lighthouse, which was another extraordinarily challenging lighthouse, was hired to do this. The construction was mostly of granite blocks. So it's 16 stories high, to give you an indication. The first 7 stories is nothing but granite blocks to give it a foundation. It's built on what's called North Seal rock, and the blocks were, I don't know, do you manufacture blocks? Cut in Humboldt and were shipped up here. To construct the lighthouse, it could only be done at low tide. So what they did was to bring out 2 ships with crew on it. At low tide, they would have lines that went across those 2 ships. They were on each side of the rock, and they would have a gondola that would swing down and drop the workers off on the rocks so they could do their thing for about 6 hours at a time. They would then load them back up when tide came in, and they would put them back on the boats. And then as as high tide started going out again, then they would bring them back. And this happened around the clock. It took 10 years to construct this lighthouse. It is also known for, and we'll talk more about that, but the Brother Jonathan was what led to that being constructed. And interestingly enough, most harbors have to fight Congress to get funded for lighthouses. The Point St. George Reef Lighthouse did not. They got it through as soon as they had the funding for it. Congress put it right through. They did not have multiple rejections for building it because of the significant loss of life. It still maintains today the worst maritime tragedy off the West Coast to this day. So again, we were talking about some of those really super interesting things that had national impact in our tiny community, and that was one of them. So anyway, this is it's known as the Brother Jonathan Cemetery because there were people who for weeks were being washed ashore, and they could not necessarily identify all of them. In fact, there was a mass grave of 66 people that were buried that they were unable to identify from that wreck. And this was the city cemetery. So you'll notice that the headstones may be from not in those years. However, if they could identify them and they were local, then they did bury them here. A lot of people not from here that were on the ship, if they could be identified, were sent back to their family members. And yet, a lot of them could not be identified.
Trudging back to the bus over the field we now knew was a mass grave, we began the scenic drive down Pebble Beach. The next stop was Point St. George.
The U.S. Lighthouse Service was an agency that oversaw the lighthouses in the entire United States, and every lighthouse keeper was employed by them. And they, just like any other form of service, lighthouse keepers could put in for transferring to any other lighthouses, and it was usually on a seniority basis. Really interesting about this is that there were more deaths related of lighthouse keeper related to this lighthouse than any other ones, and you can kind of understand the danger associated with having to get out there by boat Like I said, the first 7 stories of the lighthouse is nothing but granite block. And then the storage area and lighthouse, and then all the way up to the top of the light itself. And did you guys get a chance to go in and see the Fresnel lens in the museum? And so I think that was a 4th order Fresnel lens. For people who are totally into lighthouses, that's very significant. Fresnel lenses were all built in France and shipped over here. And most lighthouses, it had the most, at the time in the 1800s, had the most reflective ability of any, because of the Fresnel lens construction of any other type. So if you can imagine lighthouse keepers having to go up every night, light that light, usually with whale oil was what was used at the time, and wick, and then go out and extinguish it during the day, and then go up again at night, every night climbing those lighthouses. The Fresnel lens that was out there, the lighthouse keepers, their responsibility would be, they would rotate on 2-week intervals. So what we have here is where the lighthouse keepers would lodge when they were not on duty. And then they would go out and have to be at the lighthouse. I think it was about 2 weeks at a time. And then, anyway, in the, I want to say the 50s, maybe early 60s, the lighthouse service stopped being, and all of the lighthouses were turned over to the U.S. Coast Guard service. And so they were responsible for maintaining. By that time, most of the lighthouses had beacons in them. So as we were getting more and more automated, most of the lighthouses in the United States began to have beacons. In the early 70s, the lighthouse service, there really wasn't any need anymore for having a lighthouse. And so they started offering lighthouses up to nonprofits or cities, counties, states to be able to maintain. And if that didn't happen, they then would go to auction to private buyers. And so you'll have a lot of buyers, lighthouses that are actually in private hands. There are some that are used as bed and breakfasts, and just kind of neat. But the U.S. Lighthouse Preservation Society wants to maintain the historical significance of lighthouses. In the days, though, when it was a functioning lighthouse, boats would go out there, and they would be on a lift that would actually bring them up 7 stories and put the boat on a platform where they could get off, and then they were shifted over. Anyway, it was a very lonely business. You can imagine being out there for 2 weeks, being taken all your food and supplies, and then not seeing anybody for another 2 weeks. And so in 1975, when the lighthouses were given up by the U.S. Coast Guard, some of them were put into such disrepair that they had to be demolished. They were abandoned for a while, and then there started to be a movement to help preserve this history in the United States. And the lighthouse keepers stayed here when they were not over on the lighthouse, and this was sold to private. It is a private residence, private ownership at the time, and still is to this day. But it is a fascinating, another unique thing about Del Norte Canyon history. So,
the final stop on our adventure of knowledge was the Tolowa Dunes at the end of Old Mill Road. Upon arrival, Patty once again needed to attend her second job, and so began the stamping. Once everyone's passport was adequately filled with the appropriate stamps, Patty was off, and so were we to enjoy a walk through the beautiful Tolowa Dunes. After the short but tiring walk, we arrived back at the bus and were whisked back to the Historical Society. Through the clanging of the loose luggage rack, everyone pondered what they had learned of Del Norte's history. If you would like to join in next time, keep a lookout on the Goal Facebook page for when the next zone will be. To learn more about Goal, please visit goaldn.com or call 707-464-0955. To learn more about the Del Norte Historical Society, go to delnortehistory.org or call 707-464-3922.